I haven't seen The Karate Kid in almost 30 years. It really brought back some memories, and it's a beautiful story of the connection between and friendship between Mr. Miyagi and Daniel and overcoming challenges in one's life, working hard to overcome dangers and fears and being brave. But this review is going to talk about how it reflects more on today's culture and the differences we see, more of a bit of a philosophical video. Well, I could make comments about how different the cars and clothing look to me and the memories it brings back. I'm not going to focus so much on these things. I would like to notice this movie does point out some of the problems that were there in the 80s, the problems that Generation X encountered due to their baby boomer and silent generation parents, teachers, and coaches, etc. While I definitely disagree with the far left and the dangers we have today, we have to understand that those more conservative people, those in the 80s, sometimes we are the ones culpable for creating the far left. I was trying to warn people back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, that extremes breed extremes. And because Generation X, the boomers, and silent generation weren't really addressing cultural problems that did exist, such as bullying and racism and excessive materialism, finding one's worth in money, all these various problems that were just being ignored back then, uh, there is a real issue, and this has led to the next generations of the millennials to want to address them. And they had a good desire to want to address these problems that previous generations left undone. Unfortunately, many of them are taking their manner of addressing them to extremes and creating their own problems. Nevertheless, I think what is helpful for us to do ourselves is to realize when we have been wrong, to concede those points, to admit to it. And by doing so, at times we can avoid other people overreacting to the things that we ourselves have done wrong. So, what are some things I noticed in this movie, culturally speaking, philosophically, that I want to address? And we'll talk about some of the other events and things that happened as well within it. One thing we noticed is Daniel being bullied. For example, at the soccer, he had fickle friendships. People left him because he was being bullied, and he had a fight at his soccer tryouts. The coach knows he's being bullied and does nothing about it. And this was a common occurrence in the 80s. In fact, often teachers and coaches will go after the one being bullied instead of the bully himself. Why? Because they're really just more concerned about having to deal with problems, okay? They don't want to deal with the problems and the dramas and issues. They're more concerned about the drama than helping out. And the person being bullied is causing the coach and the teacher to have trouble and issues. So bullying was something that was allowed to go on, and racism and things like that. And today, the millennials, and I guess Generation Z to some extent, is trying to address these issues. We do see later on that Daniel considered joining the Cobra Kai Karate Club. But then he saw that the bullies were there, he rethought it. But I wonder sometimes if he actually attended the club and joined it, they might start leaving him alone because he would just become a part of the group. But I don't know if that would have been a good thing with that type of teacher that was there. But another thing we see is the materialism of the 80s. The 80s. One of the girls asked Daniel, "So, do you have a bike?" He's like, "Yeah, I have a bicycle." They're like, "No, I meant a motorcycle. Do you have a motorcycle?" And they frowned with him. It was 80s materialism. One's worth was based around money. And the hypergamy still exists today, those who want to date or marry someone who's above them financially. I do see in the 80s there wasn't really a shame over materialism. There's the phrase from the 80s, greed is good. Greed is good. People's worth was based upon how much money they had. And it's understandable where such a mindset came from because, well, people from the World War II generation and the silent generation, they lived within the Great Depression. They saw what it's like to be extremely poor. And in the 80s, the World War II and silent generations, their influence was still there quite a bit. They were the parents of people and grandparents and leaders of churches and things of that nature. They were teachers and principals, leaders of society still. It wasn't the boomers yet. It wasn't definitely not Generation X who were still children for the most part. So these people went through the Great Depression and the hardship of World War II. They saw just how dangerous poverty could be, just how valuable money can be, how money could buy happiness. Because without money, you starve. Without money, you can't get your teeth pulled if you have a cavity, and you just have to suffer in horrible pain as you can't get dental work or get medical treatment or even have your baby delivered at a hospital. Money solved so many of those types of problems. So the 80s materialism was understandable if you look how it wasn't that long ago, people were living in great poverty. The silent generation and World War II people never quite let go of their fear of poverty again. I know I spent time overseas amongst very poor people in developing nations, and when they become rich or middle class, they have that same 80s materialism, that same 80s type of your worth is based on money. So you might think people who are poor don't think that wouldn't be so materialistic or value someone's worth based on money as much. In reality, it's totally different. People who have been in poverty often greatly value money and see other people's worth based on their wealth and income. Some other things I like to see from this movie is how, uh, you know, there's McDojo fighting, what's called McDojo karate, low quality karate. Daniel learned some of that at the YMCA, and we do see even the bullies using that type of karate on Daniel sometimes. Although at times we do see Mr. Miyagi and them, the bullies, using what is called Gojo Ryu, a certain type of Okinawa martial art, which is fairly effective. It's some MMA mixed martial artists do use Okinawa martial arts as a part of their portfolio of their martial arts. They mix them in of wrestling and Muay Thai, etc. But Goju Ryu is more of a not a McDojo karate. It's about using the other person's or the attacker's energy against them, sidestepping and attacking them. So I just thought it was interesting seeing Mr. Miyagi use some Goju Ryu in his fighting. Another thing I see is Mr. Miyagi did say, no such thing as a bad student, only a bad teacher. Or no such thing as bad student, only a bad teacher. That's not really true. I think he's mistaken there. Next thing I'd like to also point out from this movie that I've seen is just how the sensei or teacher of the Cobra Kai dojo has PTSD. He was in the Vietnam War. We see that in the film 3 as well. He's been in the Vietnam War. He really struggled from that, and that wasn't something that soldiers were really helped with back then. People didn't even really talk about it, that post-traumatic stress syndrome, and how harmful it was. And I think that sensei was allowing that to affect his students' lives as well, taking it out on them. It's also interesting to note in the Cobra Kai dojo is the black kid that they have lose the fight, always the one being losing and stuff. They had him losing the tournament as well. All right. But another thing I'd like to also talk about here is that Daniel talked about how he needed Mr. Miyagi's help because Mr. Miyagi was already involved because Mr. Miyagi fought the bullies and hit them, defended Daniel. Mr. Miyagi himself was involved and he did need to be there for Daniel. It was his obligation. And he listened. When Daniel said, you are involved in this, because you defended me, things are now going to be much, much worse for me. And Mr. Miyagi listened to that. At first, he did not want to help, but he was open to being persuaded. And it's a good lesson for us once to be open-minded, hear what someone else has to say, and to take the compassionate response. We then see later in the film more materialism. The girl's parents, the girl that Daniel wanted to date, were very rich, quite wealthy. And they didn't want Daniel to date her. Why? They explain later on. It's because of the part of the town he's from, the kind of car his mom drives, and things of that nature. He just wasn't wealthy enough to date their daughter. They wanted her to date Johnny, the bully, instead. Even though Johnny is abusive and has a violent streak to him and aggressive, and you even see in the movie he's touching her when she clearly says to him that's not welcome, which is a problem we do see in the 80s and 90s. Men touching women inappropriately when they've been clearly have been told no and thinking they can just get away with it. Because we let that problem go in the 80s, well, now today we have the Me Too movement, which has taken many who follow the movement have definitely taken things way, way too far. And it's problematic how far they have taken things. But what led to the extremes we see today amongst millennials and the past 5 or 10 years to get to where they're at? Well, extremes breed extremes because the silent generation that was often silent towards women being sexually abused or being touched inappropriately, bullying, materialism, the silent generation was silent regarding these things. And they raised the Generation X or the boomers themselves were just busy at their jobs, neglected their children, very neglectful. This neglect let problems go on. They didn't want to deal with these problems, and it led to the extremes we now see today. So the parents of Daniel's girlfriend did not want her to date him, and her friends as well said, "I don't know what she sees in him." Well, what did she see in him? She saw good things about him. She saw that he was willing to stand up for her at great risk to himself. That there was a group of bigger boys who were there who could hurt him. And he took a stand for her on that beach, willing to let himself be hurt, to protect her and to stand for her honor and her property. And she saw that he was a kind and caring person, willing to sacrifice and give of himself for her. And that he can also be funny and tell jokes and be fun to hang out with. That's what she saw. Those are good things. But unfortunately, her friends and the parents, they just looked at money and wealth and strength and status. So Mr. Miyagi begins training Daniel. He talks about how there's no defense against a crane kick, which simply isn't true. That's absurd. The crane kick has plenty of weaknesses. Um, there's other good lessons from he learned from the karate. How Mr. Miyagi said, "You learn karate so you don't have to fight," and that is true. The big stick policy by sometimes being a more muscular person or learning martial arts, showing that you can defend yourself, or at least given the perception that you can defend yourself, can cause you to avoid fights in the first place. When you're weak, you often become a target. When you're strong, people leave you alone. You often just avoid having fights in the first place. But as they're training, Miyagi's training Daniel, we learn that Miyagi's wife and child died, or child that was soon to be born died, while in a Japanese internment camp. This internment camp was in America during World War II, even though Japanese Americans were even contributing to the war effort to help fight for America, their families were imprisoned. And the way this was done is a really sad and tragic event that we hardly learned about back in the 80s. I think it was mentioned briefly here and there, but there were flaws in America's history. There are plenty of flaws and things we have done wrong as Americans, and they're not always mentioned. And once again, extremes breed extremes because they weren't talked about. Then the millennials come and learn about these things through the internet or through their Marxist professors and universities, and things sometimes get blown out of proportion. America is called the worst country in the world by these people. It's the worst country in the world as they learn about this, and they were never taught these things about America's flaws. In reality, America is not the worst country in the world. It's a great country, not perfect, but it's a great country. You look at the history of other nations, they have plenty of their flaws, whether Europeans, Asians, or Africans, or South Americans, or Native Americans, Indians, it doesn't matter. Polynesians, Arabs, we see all these nations, all these peoples throughout history, throughout the centuries, have their own set of flaws. America is not the worst country in the world. You can look at current ratings of America, living standards and stuff. It's not out of the almost 200 countries in the world. It's not the worst of all. For some ratings, it's not number one. It may come in 16th place or 32nd place, 8th place, first in some categories. That doesn't make it the worst country in the world. But America has done things wrong, and I think as we talk about these things, if we would have, um, you know, Generation X and previous generations, they were just taught to just glorify America, to ignore these issues. America's great, there's nothing wrong. Well, that extreme of thinking America is perfect led the millennials and what they're trying to do to Generation Z to think or picture America as being the worst nation in the world, which is absurd. Moderation is needed. We see some other things in this movie. How Mr. Miyagi can't drive the car; he doesn't have a license, and we also see him drinking quite often. I wonder why he doesn't have his license. Perhaps he got a he lost his he got a DUI, um, lost his license because he was drinking. Who knows? But still, the bond, how Daniel and Mr. Miyagi could connect together and be there for each other, is just wonderful. Daniel said to Mr. Miyagi, "You're the best friend I ever had." And I think that's great that he had the friendship this shows. And Daniel goes to the tournament, and against all odds, he wins it. And even the bullies, they congratulate Daniel, and I think you see some change in them as well, that maybe what they're learning from the bad sensei isn't right. So it's just a very beautiful movie to think about how we can, through hard work, overcome things. It's a movie of friendship. It's a movie of working hard to accomplish what you need to accomplish, standing up for others to protect them, looking at our own flaws and how we need to change. And I hope maybe this review, philosophical review, could be a moment for us all to think and reflect of the different generations and lessons we can learn. How in the 80s there were problems. It was not the glory days. I look back with nostalgia upon the 80s and 90s in some ways, but in reality, there were definitely some downsides to it. Yes, people were more friendly and I think open with one another, and there was all kinds of other benefits, but there were definitely some real problems and issues that were not being addressed. And because the previous generations of Generation X, the boomers, silent generation, the World War II generation, they did not deal with and address these problems, these problematic problems, the famous word amongst millennials, problematic. Because bullying and racism and materialism weren't really being dealt with, that neglect led to the extremes we're seeing today. So I hope and pray for us all to just learn our lessons and to learn to live in peace with one another, to learn to love and tolerate one another. When we do things wrong, to deal with it, to address it.